right, my dear friends. So we've talked about what we think they should find, and we said we don't know. We talked about whether we think we believe what they're going to find, and we said maybe. And now finally we've come to what you've all been waiting for, which is to find out what they actually found. Although you've all done the reading, so you already know. So in this table here, what we can see is essentially the estimates that they find of the effective ban-the-box policies on employment rates for white, black, and Hispanic young men without college degrees under a variety of different sets of controls and assumptions. And I'm going to go ahead and ignore columns 1 through 4 because I don't think that any of this is plausible until they've fully interacted with race models. But if we do so, what we're going to see is that in all of the remaining models here, they're going to find effectively no effect of ban-the-box policies on employment rates for white men, right? These are estimates that are in the range of about 1/3 of 1% to about 1 percentage point changes in employment. For black men and Hispanic men, though, they're going to find pretty significant declines in employment, especially for black men, right? So we can see that depending on which model you prefer, they're going to find somewhere between a 3.5% and a 3% decline in percentage point decline in employment for black men. Whereas for Hispanic men, they're going to find somewhere around a 2 percentage point decline in employment, although that's going to be less precisely estimated than the effect for black men. So if we think that this is a result of statistical discrimination, these estimates line up pretty well with what we should expect, which is that because black men have the highest rates of arrest and incarceration, they're going to have the most negative effect from ban-the-box policies, whereas Hispanic men are going to have somewhere in between, and white men are going to have the least negative effect. Okay, so should we believe these results? As we talked about in the last video, one of the key questions here is going to be, did control cities and treatment cities have the same changes in employment over time before ban-the-box went into effect? If the answer to that question is no, then we're going to be really skeptical of these results because it's going to suggest that there were some other changes happening in, for example, large cities or more highly educated cities than in cities that were smaller or had lower levels of education that happened to coincide with ban-the-box. On the other hand, if the answer is yes, we can't be all that confident because we still could have other policies that changed at the same time as ban-the-box. So what we're going to see when we look at this is that for black men, in about the year before ban-the-box goes into effect, we see very similar changes in average employment for black men in areas that did implement ban-the-box in blue here, and in areas that didn't implement ban-the-box in red here. And we see a marked decline in employment for black men in areas that did implement ban-the-box around the implementation of ban-the-box, while employment rates for areas that didn't implement ban-the-box continue changing in about the same way they did before. So overall, we can look at this and we can feel reasonably confident that we're not picking up simple differences in trends in employment over time in these two different kinds of cities. Likewise, if we look at employment rates for Hispanic men, we're going to see the same thing. There's really no evidence of a difference in trend in areas that did and didn't implement ban-the-box before the policy goes into effect, whereas after the policy goes into effect, we see a marked decline in employment among Hispanic men in areas that do implement ban-the-box. And finally, we're going to see a similar story for white men, right? We're going to see essentially no change in employment in areas that do and don't implement ban-the-box before it goes into effect, and no change in employment in areas that do and don't implement ban-the-box after it goes into effect. So these graphs line up pretty well with what we should expect to see if ban-the-box is having a real effect on employment for black and Hispanic men, and if the areas that do implement ban-the-box, if the areas that don't implement ban-the-box are a reasonable control group for the areas that do implement ban-the-box. So in addition to these main findings, the authors are also going to present a couple of supplementary findings that should help us conclude whether we think that these negative effects that we see on employment of young black and Hispanic men are likely to be a result of statistical discrimination because employers worry that they have criminal records, or a result of other coincidental changes in policy, as we've talked about. So one of these is going to be that if these reductions in employment are about employers avoiding workers who might have recent criminal histories, then we shouldn't see declines in employment for workers who might have similar jobs, work in similar occupations, but would not be suspected of having criminal histories. So what this table is going to do is test exactly this hypothesis by looking at how Ban the Box changed employment for a number of different groups that might take similar jobs as the young, less educated Black and Hispanic workers, but not be suspected of having criminal histories. So first of all, here we can see that for young workers with college degrees, we really see no effect whatsoever of Ban the Box for anyone, which is consistent with thinking that college-educated workers are unlikely to be suspected of having criminal histories. On the other hand, if we look at older workers by education, we're going to see that older Black workers without college educations, so that is Black workers who are either have no high school diploma or no college degree and are over the age of 35, see increases in employment, which would be consistent with them taking jobs that would otherwise go to younger Black and Hispanic workers. On the other hand, we see this reduction in employment for older Hispanic workers without a high school diploma, which doesn't really fit with their story. So to some extent, we can say that we're seeing some evidence consistent with what we'd expect if this was a result of Ban the Box. On the other hand, we don't see perfect evidence here. Okay, so the next thing that they're going to look at is whether Ban the Box has larger effects in relatively weak economies with high unemployment or in relatively strong economies with low unemployment. Now, the reason that this is theoretically interesting is because, as we saw when we worked through the theory of statistical discrimination, we expect Ban the Box policies to increase employers' likelihood of interviewing Black and Hispanic applicants who do have criminal histories, but to decrease their likelihood of interviewing Black and Hispanic applicants who don't have criminal histories. Whether the one effect is going to outweigh the other is going to depend on just how picky employers are going to be. In other words, if employers are in a position to be very picky about who they interview, Ban the Box policies might result in young Black and Hispanic men without college degrees being pushed below the threshold of interviewability because employers are being very stringent about who they interview. On the other hand, if employers aren't in a position to be very picky, that might raise Black and Hispanic workers with criminal records above the threshold to be interviewed and not have very much effect on the number of interviews given to Black and Hispanic young men without criminal histories. So what they see when they actually look at this is mostly a big mess, right? They aren't able to estimate the relationship between the effect of Ban the Box and unemployment rates very well. But what they try to do is they say, does Ban the Box have a bigger effect in areas that have high unemployment or in areas that have low unemployment? And if we look at their estimates for Black workers, what we're going to see is that they estimate the effect of Ban the Box in areas with 5% unemployment as being somewhere around a 2 to 3% reduction in employment for Black men, whereas in areas with high unemployment, with 9% unemployment, that effect rises to about a 3.5% reduction in employment for Black men. Likewise for Hispanic workers, right, in areas with low unemployment, they estimate the effect of Ban the Box to be somewhere between a 0 effect on Hispanic workers to a negative 1 percentage point reduction in employment. But in areas with really, really high unemployment, with really weak economies where employers can be picky, that effect increases to somewhere between a 2.5% reduction in employment to over 3% reduction in employment. And for white men, we see that in weak economies and in strong economies, we really don't see very much of a difference at all. Okay, so to recap our findings, what we found is that Ban the Box policies, which reduce employers' information about potential employees' criminal records, might reduce employment rates among young, less educated Black and Hispanic men, which is to say among demographic groups that employers might perceive as being more likely to have criminal histories. And there's a couple things that I want to say about this or think about this before I let you guys go. So the first thing is, I think it's important to note that this example of statistical discrimination really highlights the fact that even if statistical discrimination represents employers making judgments that are correct on average, that is accurately responding to statistical information about various groups of people, there's still real forms of discrimination. In other words, from the perspective of a given individual, young Black or Hispanic, less educated worker, what's happening as a result of Ban the Box policies is that workers who don't have criminal records are being assumed to have criminal records on the basis of their race, their age, their gender. And so this is exactly the same in terms of the ethical implications of discrimination as other forms of taste-based discrimination. Another thing I want to point out here is this is an example where economic theory might give us a conclusion about the likely effects of a policy that's a little bit counterintuitive. So ban-the-box policies seem like they might be most helpful on average to young Black and Hispanic men, because young Black and Hispanic men are more likely than other groups of workers to have criminal records, and therefore to benefit from ban-the-box. But if we use the models that we've worked through here to think about the likely employer reaction to these policies, we're going to come to very different conclusions about the likely effects of these policies. Now, the last thing I want to say is, let's think about whether there's other variants of a ban-the-box policy that might have different effects. In other words, is it the case that we should conclude from this research that we should never restrict employer access to information to things like criminal histories? Or should we conclude that there's different ways of restricting access to criminal histories that could be potentially helpful? So one version of this I want you to think about is, what if instead of just banning the box, in other words, what if instead of just restricting employer access to information in the resume stage, we restricted employer access to information of criminal histories at all stages? In other words, would we expect to have a more negative or a less negative effect on the employment rates of young Black and Hispanic men if we made criminal histories private entirely? Now, to think about this, let's think about the fact that, as we talked about, restricting access just at the resume screening stage might increase the number of interviews that men with criminal histories get without significantly increasing the number of job offers they get, because employers that discriminate against workers with criminal histories might be more likely to reject their applications once they do learn about criminal records. So on the one hand, we might think that this would be a more beneficial policy for workers who do have criminal records. On the other hand, of course, we might think it would heighten statistical discrimination against groups that are perceived to have higher rates of criminal records. Second thing I want you to think about is, what if we paired ban-the-box policies with something like the Rooney Rule that the NFL uses, which is to say, a rule that says that in order to fill a position, employers must have a certain number of interview slots reserved for employees from underrepresented minority backgrounds. So in the NFL, this rule is essentially that all head coaching jobs must have at least one underrepresented minority interview. We have a similar rule saying that a certain percentage of interview slots have to be reserved for minority applicants. This might help alleviate the disadvantages of ban-the-box by requiring employers to reserve a certain number of slots for underrepresented minority candidates, and thus making it harder for employers to discount all applications from young Black and Hispanic men. Of course, on the other hand, we might expect that employers would comply with these sorts of regulations by interviewing larger numbers of older Black and Hispanic men, or more educated Black and Hispanic men, or Black and Hispanic women. In other words, groups of people who meet the qualifications but have lower likelihoods of having a criminal record. Okay, thank you so much for bearing with me. I can't wait to talk to you all about this via Blue Jeans, and I hope that you're having an absolutely wonderful day.